The ancient computer that shouldn't exist. The Mediterranean sun glinted off the bronze fragments as Greek sponge divers hauled their discovery onto the deck of their boat in 19. They had been working the waters off the island of Antikythera, recovering artifacts from a Roman shipwreck that had rested on the seafloor for over 2,000 years. Among the marble statues and pottery shards lay a corroded lump of bronze that seemed unremarkable compared to the other treasures. The divers had no way of knowing they had recovered what would become one of archaeology's most disturbing discoveries, a device that would force historians to reconsider everything they believed about ancient technological capabilities. The corroded bronze mechanism sat in storage for decades before scholars began to understand its true significance. When archaeologists finally subjected the fragments to X-ray analysis in the 1970s, they discovered an intricate system of interlocking gears unlike anything known from the ancient world. The mechanism served as an analog computer designed to predict astronomical events with remarkable accuracy. It could calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and known planets for any given date, predict eclipses decades in advance, and track the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. Carbon dating confirmed that the Antikythera mechanism had been constructed around 100 BCE during the Hellenistic period when Greek culture dominated the eastern Mediterranean. This dating created an immediate problem for historians who had assumed that such complex mechanical engineering was impossible in the ancient world. The Greeks who created this device possessed detailed knowledge of planetary orbital periods that modern astronomy has confirmed to be accurate within minimal margins of error. They understood that lunar cycles could be predicted using mathematical ratios and that eclipse patterns followed calculable sequences. Imagine the implications of this discovery for our understanding of ancient intellectual achievement. This mathematical sophistication required generations of careful observation and theoretical development that historians had not suspected existed in such refined form during the Hellenistic period. The precision required to create the device's gear ratios and astronomical calculations suggested knowledge that scholars believed had been lost during the fall of the Roman Empire and not rediscovered until the Renaissance. The device's sophistication was unmatched in the archaeological record until much later periods. Modern attempts to reconstruct the Antikythera mechanism have required advanced computer-aided design and precision machining equipment to replicate the ancient device's capabilities. Engineers using contemporary manufacturing techniques have struggled to match the precision of the original bronze gears, raising uncomfortable questions about ancient technological capabilities that seem to have vanished completely from the historical record. Only fragments of the original mechanism survive, with an estimated 2/3 of the device lost to corrosion and the passage of time. This partial preservation means that researchers can only speculate about the mechanism's complete capabilities and the full extent of its astronomical calculations. The surviving fragments suggest that the complete device may have tracked additional celestial bodies and performed calculations that are now impossible to verify or reconstruct. What makes the Antikythera mechanism particularly unsettling is not just its technological sophistication, but what its existence implies about lost knowledge from the ancient world. If Greek engineers could create such complex mechanical computers, what other advanced devices might have existed during antiquity? The mechanism suggests that entire branches of ancient technology may have disappeared so completely that we have no historical record of their existence. The device forces us to confront the possibility that technological progress is not always linear and cumulative. Civilizations can lose capabilities that took centuries to develop, and knowledge that seems fundamental can vanish when the social and economic conditions that supported its development change. The fall of the Roman Empire may have resulted in the loss of technological knowledge that would not be rediscovered for over a millennium. If the Hellenistic world could produce this, what other technical knowledge might have been lost? The Antikythera mechanism represents a technological ghost from the ancient world, a device that should not exist according to our current understanding of historical development. Its bronze gears continue to challenge assumptions about ancient intellectual achievement and technological capability. The mechanism proves that our ancestors possessed mathematical and engineering knowledge far more sophisticated than historians had imagined possible for the Hellenistic period. This ancient computer reminds us that human knowledge can be fragile and that even the most remarkable achievements can be forgotten when civilizations collapse or transform. The mechanism stands as evidence that history may have erased technologies and knowledge systems that took generations to develop and centuries to rediscover. But lost technological knowledge wasn't the only type of information that could vanish from human understanding. Sometimes the most tantalizing mysteries involved written records that survived the centuries physically intact, yet remained completely incomprehensible to anyone who tried to read them. What are the most notorious, unsolved historical crimes? Imagine walking into a room where the floorboards creak beneath your feet and you realize you're standing on human remains. This isn't fiction. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Throughout history, some of the most notorious crimes have vanished into shadow. They leave behind only fragments of evidence. Generations of unanswered questions follow. An abandoned merchant ship found drifting perfectly intact. An English colony that simply disappeared. These unsolved mysteries reveal something disturbing about how easily people can vanish without a trace. Today we examine mysteries that weren't just crimes. They were events that rewrote how people feared the world. Our first case begins in the fog-soaked streets of Victorian London, where terror took on a new form. The Whitechapel terror that never ended. The gas lamps cast weak yellow circles through the thick London fog as women hurried through Whitechapel's narrow streets, their footsteps echoing off wet cobblestones. They pulled their shawls tight and avoided eye contact with strangers, sensing something had changed in their neighborhood. What they couldn't know was that they were living through the birth of something new and terrible in human history. The modern serial killer was being born in those shadowed alleys, and his methods would create a blueprint for terror that still guides criminal investigations today. Jack the Ripper's 5 canonical murders in 1888 established patterns that criminologists still recognize. Between August and November of that year, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were killed in ways that shocked even hardened Victorian police officers. Each murder escalated in brutality, suggesting a killer who was learning and adapting his techniques. The mutilations were performed with a level of anatomical awareness that led contemporaries to suspect medical or butchery experience, yet the killer moved through Whitechapel's maze of courts and alleys with the confidence of a local resident. You might think that 135 years of investigation would have solved this case. Instead, each new theory has only multiplied the questions. Over 100 suspects have been proposed, from local butchers to members of the royal family. The Metropolitan Police files contain thousands of documents, witness statements, and physical evidence, yet the killer's identity remains as hidden as it was in 1888. The surgical precision of the mutilations continues to puzzle forensic experts. Annie Chapman's uterus was removed along with parts of her bladder and vagina, accomplished in near-total darkness within minutes. Catherine Eddowes lost a kidney and part of her uterus with facial mutilations that appeared almost ritualistic, yet these same precise cuts were performed in locations where the killer risked discovery at any moment, suggesting someone who knew exactly when and where he could work undisturbed. Police received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer, creating an early example of how media attention can contaminate criminal investigations. Most were obvious hoaxes written by attention seekers or journalists hoping to sell newspapers. Among hundreds of hoaxes, one letter, the Notorious "From Hell" note, was accompanied by half a human kidney that contemporaries linked to one victim. So who did it? Over a century later, theories still outnumber proofs. Scientific tests on surviving materials have been inconclusive, producing conflicting results that cannot definitively identify any suspect. Each technological advance seems to fracture the case into more pieces rather than bringing clarity. The Ripper case spawned an entire cottage industry of amateur detectives and conspiracy theorists. Books, documentaries, and websites propose new solutions annually, each author convinced they've found the crucial piece of evidence that professional investigators missed. Some focus on royal conspiracies involving Prince Albert Victor, while others examine local residents like Aaron Kosminski or Montagu John Druitt. The sheer volume of theories demonstrates how desperately people want this mystery solved, but it also shows how the lack of definitive evidence allows any theory to seem plausible. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't the brutality of the murders, but how it transformed from a local crime spree into a global phenomenon that refuses to die. The Ripper became the first celebrity serial killer, his crimes amplified by newspaper coverage that reached far beyond London. Victorian society was both horrified and fascinated by the murders, creating a template for how modern media covers similar crimes. The killer understood this attention and seemed to feed on it, writing letters that played directly to public fears and media sensationalism. This pattern of an unknown predator terrorizing a community would repeat throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The Zodiac Killer, BTK, and dozens of other cases followed the Ripper's template: calculated brutality, media manipulation, and strategic invisibility. Law enforcement agencies still study the Whitechapel murders, not because they hope to solve them, but because they reveal how a clever killer can exploit the very systems designed to catch him. The Ripper did something worse than murder. He turned violence into spectacle, and ensured anonymity became his lasting fame. The fog that concealed his crimes has never truly lifted, proving that some mysteries grow more powerful when they remain unsolved. But London's gaslit streets weren't the only place where people could vanish without explanation. Sometimes the disappearance happened far from any witness, in places where the only sound was wind and water. The ship that sailed into legend. The crew of the Dei Grazia squinted through their spyglasses at the ship on the horizon, its sails catching the Atlantic wind in an odd, uneven pattern. Captain David Morehouse felt something cold settle in his stomach as they drew closer to the vessel drifting between Portugal and the Azores on that December afternoon in 1872. The British brigantine Dei Grazia found the Mary Celeste adrift on December 5, 1870. The ship appeared to be sailing itself, moving with the currents but showing no signs of human control. When they finally pulled alongside, they discovered the Mary Celeste in perfect sailing condition, her cargo secure and her hull sound, but completely devoid of human life. The Mary Celeste had been carrying 10 people when she left New York Harbor a month earlier. Captain Benjamin Briggs commanded the vessel, accompanied by his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. 7 crew members completed the roster for what should have been a routine voyage to Genoa, carrying a cargo of denatured alcohol. The ship was seaworthy, well supplied, and equipped for a long ocean crossing. She carried enough food and fresh water to last 6 months, yet everyone aboard had vanished without sending a single distress signal or leaving any coherent explanation for their disappearance. The boarding party from the Dei Grazia found the ship's logbook lying open on the chart table, its final entry dated November 25th. The entry was routine and unremarkable, recording the ship's position and noting fair weather conditions. Nothing in Captain Briggs's handwriting suggested any concern or emergency. The entry simply ended mid-voyage, as if the writer had been interrupted. 9 days had passed between that final entry and the discovery of the drifting ship, 9 days during which 10 people had somehow decided to abandon a perfectly functional vessel. You can imagine the boarding party's confusion as they searched through the ship's cabins and found everything exactly where it had been left. Personal effects, a stocked galley, and sealed cargo were all found undisturbed. If pirates had attacked the vessel, they would have taken valuable items. If the abandonment had been planned, people would have packed their belongings. The most puzzling discovery was that the ship's lifeboat was missing from its davits, yet no distress signals had ever been received by any passing vessels or coastal stations. Maritime protocol required ships to assist vessels in distress, and the Atlantic shipping lanes were busy enough that a lifeboat carrying 10 people should have been spotted within days. Search parties scoured the waters around the Mary Celeste's projected course, but found no wreckage, no bodies, and no trace of the missing lifeboat. 10 people had simply vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Maritime experts have proposed dozens of theories to explain the abandonment, but each explanation fails when confronted with the physical evidence. Piracy seemed logical until investigators realized no valuables had been taken and no signs of violence existed aboard the ship. Some theorized that the cargo of denatured alcohol had created explosive vapors forcing evacuation, but the barrels remained intact and properly sealed. Natural disasters offered another potential explanation, but the Mary Celeste showed no damage from severe weather, and her rigging remained properly set. The cargo itself ruled out the most obvious explanation for maritime abandonment. The 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol were largely intact when the ship was discovered, eliminating fears of explosion that might have driven the crew to flee. Captain Briggs was an experienced mariner who understood his cargo's properties and would not have panicked unnecessarily. What makes the Mary Celeste case particularly disturbing isn't the mystery of how 10 people disappeared, but the realization that they chose to leave a safe, well-supplied ship for the uncertainty of an open boat in the Atlantic Ocean. What could make experienced sailors choose an open boat over a seaworthy ship? Experienced sailors understood that abandoning ship was usually a death sentence. Lifeboats carried limited supplies and offered little protection against ocean storms. The fact that these people willingly entered such a boat suggests they feared something aboard the Mary Celeste more than they feared death by exposure or drowning. The psychological impact of the Mary Celeste extends beyond maritime mystery into existential terror. Ships are supposed to be controlled environments where human presence is constant and necessary. Finding a vessel that continues to function without its crew challenges our basic understanding of how the world works. The ship became a floating tomb without bodies, a mechanical ghost that sailed itself across the ocean while its human occupants simply ceased to exist. The Mary Celeste established the archetype for ghost ship legends that continue to capture imaginations today. Her story proved that technological progress cannot eliminate certain types of mystery, and that even in our interconnected world, people can still disappear without explanation. The empty ship drifting through endless ocean became a symbol of how quickly human presence can be erased from even the most controlled environments. But the ocean wasn't the only place where entire groups of people could vanish without explanation. Sometimes the disappearance happened on solid ground, in places that were supposed to be permanent settlements. The colony that vanished into thin air, the sound of boots on wooden planks echoed across the empty settlement as Governor John White walked through the abandoned houses on Roanoke Island. 3 years had passed since he left these colonists to establish England's first permanent foothold in the New World, and now he found only silence where families should have been living. The houses stood intact but hollow, their doors hanging open to reveal vacant rooms where children had once played and families had shared meals. On a wooden post at the edge of the settlement, someone had carved a single word, Croatoan. White stared at those 8 letters, carved deep into the wood with deliberate care. This was not a message scrawled in panic or desperation. Someone had taken time to ensure the word would remain visible and readable. The colonists had agreed before his departure that if they moved to another location, they would leave clear signs of their destination. If they were in distress, they would carve a cross above any message. White examined the post carefully, searching for that cross, but found only the stark letters spelling out the name of a nearby island. The 11,115 colonists who vanished from Roanoke Island were families committed to permanent settlement, including White's own daughter Eleanor Dare and her infant Virginia, the first English child born in America. These were not transient explorers, but people who had crossed an ocean with household goods, farming tools, and personal possessions that spoke of long-term planning. Children played in these streets while adults worked to establish crops and build relationships with local tribes. 3 years should have been enough time for a dedicated group to establish clear signs of habitation. Successful colonies left archaeological evidence through refuse pits, cemetery grounds, fortifications, and permanent structures. The Roanoke colonists had time to plant multiple crop seasons, establish trade relationships, and create the infrastructure necessary for survival. Yet when White returned, he found no mass graves that might indicate disease or starvation, no signs of violence that might suggest conflict, and no clear trail leading away from the settlement. The carved message pointed toward Croatoan Island, known today as Hatteras Island, located about 50 miles south of Roanoke. White had planned to search there immediately, but severe weather and concerns about his ship's safety forced him to abandon the search and return to England. When later expeditions finally reached Croatoan Island, they found no trace of the missing colonists. The island's inhabitants, members of the Croatoan tribe who had maintained friendly relations with the English, claimed no knowledge of 115 European refugees seeking shelter or assistance. Archaeological teams have spent centuries searching for definitive evidence of the colonists' fate, uncovering tantalizing but inconclusive clues throughout the region. European artifacts have been discovered at Native American sites, including copper and glass items that match the time period of the lost colony. Some excavations have revealed what appear to be European-style buildings constructed using both English and Native American techniques, suggesting potential integration between the two cultures. However, none of these discoveries can be definitively linked to the specific Roanoke colonists or provide clear evidence of what happened to entire families. Three main theories persist: integration with local tribes, forced removal or attack, and dispersal due to starvation or disease, none of which the archaeological record conclusively proves. Relations between the Roanoke settlers and surrounding tribes had been generally peaceful, with evidence of trade and cooperation. European diseases had devastating effects on Native American populations, but the reverse was also possible. If crops failed and supply ships were delayed, the settlers might have been forced to disperse in search of food and shelter. The psychological impact of the Roanoke mystery extends beyond historical curiosity into fundamental fears about human vulnerability. The idea that an entire community can simply disappear challenges our assumptions about permanence and security. These colonists represent our own ancestors' courage in facing unknown dangers, but their disappearance reminds us how quickly human presence can be erased from the landscape. Modern DNA studies have attempted to trace potential connections between contemporary populations and the lost colonists, focusing on Native American communities in the region where European ancestry might indicate intermarriage with survivors. Some genetic studies have identified markers consistent with 16th-century European populations among certain tribal groups, but these results remain inconclusive and could represent contact with other European expeditions or later settlers. Roanoke represents one of America's most enduring colonial mysteries, demonstrating how entire communities can vanish from history, leaving behind only questions that become more disturbing with each generation that fails to find answers. The settlement that was supposed to establish English dominance in North America instead became a haunting reminder of human vulnerability. Roanoke shows how whole communities can be erased from the record, leaving a carved word to haunt generations. But disappearing wasn't always about entire groups vanishing into wilderness or fog. Sometimes the most chilling mysteries involved killers who made themselves known, who craved attention and turned murder into a public spectacle, yet still managed to slip away into anonymity. The killer who played games with police. The phone rang at the San Francisco Chronicle on August 1, 1969, and the voice on the other end spoke with calm precision that chilled the reporter who answered. The caller claimed responsibility for the murders of 3 young people in Northern California and threatened to kill again unless his letter appeared on the front page of 3 major newspapers. Within hours, the Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald each received identical envelopes containing a letter signed with a symbol that would become infamous, a circle with a cross through it. The Zodiac killer had announced himself to the world. The letter writer claimed responsibility for the murder of Darlene Ferrin and the attack on Michael Maggio at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, providing details about the crime that only the killer could have known. He described the ammunition he used, the position of the victim's car, and specific details about the attack that had not been released to the public. The letter also referenced the December 1968 murder of teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday at Lake Herman Road, establishing a pattern of attacks on young couples in isolated locations. Each letter contained 1/3 of a cryptographic cipher consisting of symbols, letters, and numbers arranged in a grid pattern. The killer demanded that all 3 newspapers print their portion of the cipher on their front pages, threatening to go on a killing spree if his demands weren't met. This wasn't simply a murderer seeking attention, but someone who had turned his crimes into an elaborate intellectual game. Within days of publication, amateur codebreakers Donald and Betty Harden cracked the first cipher, revealing a message that claimed killing people was more enjoyable than killing wild animals because humans represented the ultimate prey. However, the cipher provided no clues about the killer's identity. The killer's next confirmed attack occurred on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa, where he approached college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, wearing a hooded costume with his Zodiac symbol prominently displayed. After binding his victims and claiming he was an escaped convict, he stabbed both repeatedly. Shepard died from her wounds, but Hartnell survived to provide investigators with detailed descriptions of the attacker. Later that evening, the killer called police to report his own crime, speaking in the same calm, measured tone that witnesses remembered from his previous calls. 2 weeks later, taxi driver Paul Stein was shot and killed in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood. 3 teenagers witnessed the attack, watching as the killer calmly wiped down the taxi's interior before cutting away a piece of Stein's bloody shirt. The witnesses provided detailed descriptions to police dispatchers, but a communication error resulted in patrol officers looking for a black male suspect rather than the white male the teenagers had actually seen. The killer sent another letter to the Chronicle 3 days later, including a piece of Stein's shirt as proof of his involvement and threatening to attack schoolchildren. Law enforcement agencies launched one of the most extensive investigations in California criminal history, interviewing thousands of witnesses and examining hundreds of potential suspects. Despite thousands of pages of investigative material, physical evidence has not yielded a definitive match. Composite sketches based on witness descriptions varied significantly, showing suspects with different facial features, ages, and builds. The killer continued sending letters and ciphers to newspapers for several years, with some messages containing additional cryptographic puzzles. The ciphers and copycat letters suggested someone who enjoyed intellectual games. Whether or not they were a trained cryptographer remains unproven. Some ciphers were eventually solved by amateur teams decades later, but none produced a credible identification for the killer. What made the Zodiac case particularly disturbing was the killer's obvious enjoyment of media attention and public fear. His letters revealed someone who took pleasure in manipulating law enforcement and terrorizing the general public through psychological warfare. He used letters and puzzles to extend terror beyond his crimes, transforming murder into a public, unsolvable performance. The killer understood how mass media worked and exploited newspaper coverage to amplify his reign of terror far beyond his actual victim count. The Zodiac killer achieved exactly what he appeared to want: lasting notoriety that transcended his actual crimes while maintaining complete anonymity. He proved that in the modern age, a clever predator could use media attention to become more famous than his victims, turning murder into entertainment for a fascinated public. His case established a template that future killers would follow, showing how violence could be transformed into spectacle. But not all mysteries involve predators who crave attention and public recognition. Sometimes the most haunting disappearances involve figures who once commanded the attention of entire civilizations, only to vanish so completely that even their final resting places become legends. The search for such lost figures can span millennia, with each generation of seekers hoping to uncover what time and human ambition have conspired to hide. The Lost Queen's Hidden Grave. Cleopatra VII commanded the loyalty of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades, and negotiated with Rome's most powerful leaders, yet her final resting place has vanished more completely than those of far less significant figures. The desert sand shifts constantly across the ruins of ancient Alexandria, covering and revealing secrets that have remained buried for over 2 millennia. Somewhere beneath the modern Egyptian city lies the tomb of the last pharaoh of Egypt, described by ancient historians as magnificent beyond imagination. For over 2,000 years, treasure hunters, scholars, and excavation teams have searched for her burial site, yet it remains as elusive as the political power she once wielded. Ancient sources provide tantalizing descriptions of Cleopatra's tomb, but their accounts raise more questions than they answer. The historian Plutarch wrote that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together in a mausoleum that she had constructed during her lifetime. Suetonius mentioned that Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, visited the tomb and placed flowers on the bodies before sealing the monument. These accounts suggest that the tomb's location was well known in the immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, but subsequent centuries of political upheaval and natural disasters erased all reliable records of its whereabouts. Modern archaeological excavations in Alexandria have uncovered numerous Ptolemaic sites, revealing the sophisticated burial practices of Cleopatra's dynasty. The Ptolemies built elaborate underground tomb complexes with multiple chambers, decorated walls, and sophisticated drainage systems to protect royal mummies from moisture damage. These discoveries prove that royal tombs from Cleopatra's era were constructed to last for millennia, making their complete disappearance even more puzzling. Archaeologists have found Ptolemaic coins, statues, and architectural fragments throughout Alexandria, but none of these discoveries has led to the identification of royal burial chambers that might contain Cleopatra's remains. The changing geography of Alexandria adds another layer of complexity to the search. Ancient Alexandria was built on a series of islands and peninsulas connected by causeways and bridges. Centuries of earthquakes have dramatically altered the city's coastline, submerging large sections beneath the Mediterranean Sea. Marine archaeologists have discovered entire neighborhoods complete with statues, columns, and building foundations resting on the seafloor near Alexandria's modern harbor. The royal quarter of ancient Alexandria, where Cleopatra's tomb would most likely have been located, now lies underwater, making excavation extremely difficult and expensive. Some theories place Cleopatra's tomb in locations far from Alexandria, suggesting that her burial might have occurred in secret to protect her remains from political enemies. The temple complex at Disappearance Magna, located about 30 miles west of Alexandria, has attracted significant archaeological attention in recent years. Excavations at Disappearance Magna have found Ptolemaic material but no royal tomb. Despite discovering coins bearing Cleopatra's image and architectural elements consistent with royal construction, the site has not revealed burial chambers containing royal mummies or the distinctive grave goods that would indicate a pharaoh's final resting place. Some scholars argue the tomb may have been looted or deliberately obliterated, but we simply don't have conclusive evidence either way. Political enemies in ancient times understood the power of symbolism and often targeted monuments and burial sites to erase their opponents' legacies. Early Christian emperors ordered the destruction of pagan temples and monuments throughout the Roman Empire, and Cleopatra's tomb, with its associations with Egyptian religion and political independence, would have been a prime target for such destruction. Recent discoveries of intact royal tombs elsewhere in Egypt demonstrate that major archaeological finds remain possible, keeping hope alive among researchers. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered in 1922, proved that royal burials could survive intact for millennia under the right conditions. More recently, archaeologists have uncovered previously unknown burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technologies. These discoveries show that even heavily excavated areas can still yield significant finds, suggesting that Cleopatra's tomb might simply be hidden rather than destroyed. Modern technology offers new possibilities for locating Cleopatra's tomb, but it also reveals the scale of the challenge facing archaeologists. Ground-penetrating radar can detect underground chambers and structures, but Alexandria's dense urban development limits access to potential excavation sites. Underwater archaeology techniques have improved dramatically, allowing researchers to explore submerged sections of ancient Alexandria, but the Mediterranean's currents and sediment deposits have covered much of the ancient city under meters of sand and debris. Her palace sands are now a city. The sea has swallowed the rest. Cleopatra's missing tomb is a reminder that time and politics can erase even the most powerful human footprints. But the disappearance of rulers wasn't always about lost tombs or forgotten burial sites. Sometimes the most chilling mysteries involved those who vanished while still alive, their fate becoming a weapon in the hands of those who sought to claim their power. The royal children who disappeared. The heavy wooden doors of the Tower of London slammed shut behind 12-year-old Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard in the summer of 1483. The boys had entered the ancient fortress under the pretense of preparation for Edward's coronation, but the ceremony they expected would never come. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had declared their parents' marriage invalid, making the princes illegitimate and clearing his own path to the throne. What should have been a temporary residence became a prison from which neither child was ever seen again in public, and their disappearance remains unresolved. Edward V had been King of England for only 2 months when Parliament declared him and his brother bastards. Their father, Edward IV, had died unexpectedly in April 1483, leaving his eldest son as heir to the throne. The boy king's uncle Richard assumed the role of Lord Protector, responsible for governing England until Edward came of age. However, Richard claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a previous secret marriage contract, rendering their children ineligible for the throne. This convenient legal argument eliminated the only obstacles to Richard's own coronation as Richard III. Contemporary witnesses reported seeing both boys playing in the tower's gardens during the early weeks of their imprisonment. The princes appeared healthy and were attended by servants who ensured they received proper meals and clothing. Guards observed them walking along the tower's walls and engaging in activities appropriate for children of their age and status. However, these sightings became less frequent as summer progressed into autumn. By late 1483, reliable accounts of the prince's presence had ceased entirely, though no official announcement of their deaths ever appeared in royal records. The boy's gradual disappearance from public view created a mystery that contemporary observers noticed but dared not investigate too closely. Servants who had previously attended the princes were reassigned or dismissed without explanation. The tower's constable received orders restricting access to the sections where the boys had been housed. When foreign ambassadors inquired about the prince's welfare, they received vague assurances that the children were well, but no actual meetings were arranged. The royal court began operating as if the princes no longer existed, though their legal status remained unclear. You can imagine the fear that must have gripped anyone who might have witnessed the prince's final days. Speaking about royal matters without permission was treason, punishable by death. Servants, guards, and officials who knew what happened to Edward and Richard faced impossible choices between their consciences and their lives. The political atmosphere in Richard III's court discouraged questions about inconvenient topics, creating an environment where witnesses to potential crimes remained silent rather than risk execution for speaking the truth. Historical accounts suggest that two small skeletons were discovered during renovations in the tower, though the exact details and timing of this discovery remain disputed among historians. Various examinations of remains have been proposed over the centuries, but definitive identification has proven impossible using available methods. Requests for more thorough forensic investigation have been denied by Westminster Abbey and the royal family, leaving the identity of any discovered remains permanently uncertain. The case involves some of the most powerful figures in English history, each with compelling motives for eliminating the legitimate heirs to the throne. Richard III benefited directly from the prince's disappearance, as their removal cleared any challenge to his claim to the crown. However, Henry Tudor, who would become Henry VII after defeating Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, also had reasons to ensure the princes never returned to challenge his own legitimacy. Henry's victory established the Tudor dynasty, but his claim to the throne was relatively weak compared to the direct line represented by Edward IV's sons. The prince's disappearance reveals the brutal calculation that governed medieval royal succession. Children born into royal families understood from early ages that their bloodlines made them both precious and dangerous to competing factions. Edward and Richard represented legitimate claims to the throne that could be used by ambitious nobles to challenge any usurper's authority. Their royal blood, which should have protected them, instead made their elimination a political necessity for anyone seeking to rule England without constant threats of rebellion. Henry VII's treatment of other potential claimants suggests a systematic approach to eliminating rival bloodlines. After becoming king, Henry imprisoned or executed numerous individuals with connections to the Yorkist cause, demonstrating that the prince's fate was part of a broader pattern of political murder designed to secure the Tudor dynasty. The disappearance of Edward and Richard established a precedent for how inconvenient royal children could be handled through imprisonment or simple erasure from historical records. Two children disappeared from one of England's most secure fortresses, their fate determined by adults who saw them as obstacles rather than human beings. This is about how political power can reduce human lives to inconvenient problems to be solved through violence and silence. But power wasn't the only motive that could drive someone to commit acts so brutal they would haunt investigators for decades. Sometimes the desire for notoriety itself became the driving force behind crimes designed to shock an entire nation. The Hollywood murder that shocked America. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vacant lot at 3825 South Norton Avenue as Betty Bersinger walked with her 3-year-old daughter toward the local shoe repair shop. What she initially mistook for a discarded department store mannequin lying in the weeds turned out to be something far more horrifying. The pale, bisected body of a young woman lay precisely positioned on the grass, the murderer having cut the body with disturbing precision that suggested anatomical familiarity. The corpse had been drained of blood and scrubbed clean, posed with arms raised above the head and legs spread apart. Even the hardened Los Angeles police officers who responded to the scene had never encountered a crime scene so methodically arranged for maximum shock value. Elizabeth Short had been tortured extensively before her death. her body bearing evidence of prolonged suffering that suggested the killer had kept her alive for days. The 22-year-old aspiring actress had been bound and beaten, with rope marks visible on her wrists and ankles. Her mouth had been slashed from ear to ear in a grotesque parody of a smile, and her torso showed signs of systematic mutilation performed with what appeared to be surgical knowledge. The killer had removed her reproductive organs and carved letters into her flesh, transforming her body into a canvas for his disturbed fantasies. The precision of the bisection immediately caught the attention of forensic investigators. The body showed evidence of someone with possible medical training or extensive experience with human dissection. The killer had also performed what appeared to be systematic removal of internal organs, with careful incisions that suggested anatomical knowledge. The methodical nature of the mutilations pointed towards someone who understood human anatomy and had access to surgical instruments. Despite launching one of the largest investigations in Los Angeles Police Department history, detectives found themselves overwhelmed by false leads and amateur theories. Over 150 suspects were questioned during the investigation, ranging from medical students to butchers to morticians. The case generated more than 60 confessions from individuals seeking attention or suffering from mental illness, but none of these confessions contained details that had not already been published in newspapers. Each confession required investigation and verification, consuming valuable detective hours while producing no useful leads. The victim's complex personal life created numerous potential motives and suspects that investigators struggled to untangle. Short had moved to California from Massachusetts, leaving behind family troubles and seeking success in Hollywood's entertainment industry. She worked various temporary jobs while pursuing acting opportunities, staying with different men and women throughout the Los Angeles area. Her transient lifestyle meant that investigators had difficulty establishing a complete timeline of her activities in the months before her death. You can imagine the media frenzy that erupted when reporters learned about the case's salacious details. Newspapers competed for the most sensational headlines, with the Herald Express coining the Black Dahlia nickname that would define the case forever. The name referenced Short's dark hair and clothing, as well as a popular film noir movie of the time. Press intrusion and sensational headlines turned the investigation into a circus, making the case harder to solve. Short's associations with various men in the months before her death provided investigators with multiple potential suspects but no clear perpetrator. She had been seen with military personnel, civilian men of different ages and backgrounds, and individuals connected to both legitimate and illegitimate businesses. Some witnesses reported seeing her with men who appeared controlling or aggressive, while others described her as independent and capable of taking care of herself. The killer's apparent medical knowledge narrowed the suspect pool to individuals with access to surgical training or anatomical knowledge. Medical students, doctors, morticians, veterinarians, and military personnel with field medical experience all became potential suspects. However, this specialization also meant that hundreds of individuals in the Los Angeles area possessed the necessary skills to perform the mutilations found on Short's body. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the clear evidence that the killer designed every aspect of the crime to create maximum psychological impact. The precise positioning of the body, the surgical nature of the mutilations, and the clean presentation all suggest someone who understood how to create lasting trauma in those who discovered the scene. The killer succeeded in creating a crime so shocking that it dominated headlines for months and continues to fascinate amateur investigators decades later. The Black Dahlia case established the template for how sensational murders would be covered by mass media in the following decades. The combination of an attractive victim, mysterious circumstances, and gruesome details created a perfect storm of public interest that newspapers and magazines exploited for maximum circulation. This media coverage actually hindered the investigation by encouraging false confessions, amateur theories, and public interference with potential evidence. The case proved that some killers can achieve a twisted form of immortality by creating crimes so brutal and mysterious that they transcend their immediate impact to become permanent fixtures in popular culture. Whether crimes become legend because of their brutality or because society amplifies them, the performance of death becomes the lasting story. Elizabeth Short's name has been largely forgotten, but the Black Dahlia murder continues to generate books, documentaries, and amateur investigations that keep the killer's handiwork alive in public memory. But not all killers relied solely on brutality to terrorize their victims. Some understood that fear could be weaponized in far more creative ways, turning entire cities into stages for psychological warfare. The Jazz Age killer who terrorized New Orleans. In New Orleans during the Jazz Age, one killer understood this principle better than most. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the pre-dawn darkness as an unknown intruder methodically removed door panels from yet another family home. Between May 1918 and October 1919, this calculated approach to breaking and entering became the signature of a killer who would terrorize the city's Italian-American community while orchestrating one of the most bizarre episodes of mass psychological manipulation in American criminal history. The Axeman of New Orleans didn't simply murder his victims, he transformed an entire city's cultural identity into a weapon of fear. The killer's method revealed disturbing planning and patience that set him apart from typical criminals. Rather than forcing doors or breaking windows, the Axeman used a chisel to carefully remove wooden panels from doors, creating openings large enough for him to enter homes without triggering creaking hinges or squealing locks that might wake sleeping families. This technique required tools, time, and knowledge of door construction that suggested either professional carpentry experience or extensive preparation for each attack. Once inside, he selected weapons from the victims' own homes, axes, hatchets, and straight razors, ensuring that no evidence could trace back to him through weapon ownership or purchase records. Joseph Maggio became the Axeman's first confirmed victim on May 23, 1918, when the killer attacked the Italian grocer and his wife Catherine in their home above their store. The couple was found with their throats slashed and their heads crushed by blows from Joseph's own axe. Near their bodies, investigators discovered a panel cleanly removed from the rear door and the bloody axe discarded in the backyard. The precision of the door work and the brutal efficiency of the murders established a pattern that would terrorize New Orleans for the next 18 months. The attacks targeted Italian-American families with such consistency that investigators initially suspected organized crime connections or ethnic hatred as motives. Louis Bessumer and his common-law wife Harriet Lowe were attacked in June 1918, though both survived the initial assault. Lowe died months later from her injuries, but not before providing investigators with conflicting descriptions of their attacker that ranged from white to black to completely unclear due to her head injuries. You can imagine the growing panic within New Orleans' Italian-American community as news of each attack spread through neighborhoods where families had lived peacefully for generations. Residents began reinforcing their doors with additional locks and metal plates, but the Axeman's ability to remove panels made traditional security measures largely ineffective. Some families slept with weapons nearby, while others abandoned their homes entirely to stay with relatives in different parts of the city. The killer's most audacious act came not through violence but through psychological manipulation of the entire city population. On March 13, 1919, several New Orleans newspapers received identical letters claiming to be from the Axeman himself. The letter writer claimed to be a supernatural entity from the depths of hell, stating that mortal weapons could not harm him and that he could take any form he chose. However, the letter contained a specific demand that would transform New Orleans into an unwilling participant in the killer's twisted game. The letter demanded that jazz music be played throughout New Orleans on the night of March 19, 1919, threatening that any home not playing jazz would face his supernatural wrath while those with music would be spared. March 19, 19 became one of the most surreal nights in New Orleans history as the entire city transformed into a massive jazz concert designed to appease an unknown murderer. Dance halls remained packed until dawn, families played phonographs continuously, and the cacophony of competing jazz performances created an atmosphere where celebration and terror merged into something entirely unprecedented in American urban experience. The killer's demand succeeded in creating a citywide hostage situation where music became the ransom payment for survival. Professional musicians found themselves potentially saving lives through performance, while residents who normally avoided jazz music embraced it as protection against supernatural violence. The night passed without confirmed attacks, leading some to believe the Axeman had been satisfied by the city's compliance. However, the killer's apparent approval proved temporary. Additional attacks occurred sporadically through 1919, suggesting that the jazz night had been more psychological experiment than genuine supernatural demand. The final confirmed attack occurred in October 1919 when Mike Pepitone was killed in his home using the same panel removal technique and weapon selection that had characterized earlier crimes. The Axeman case demonstrated how a single individual could manipulate mass psychology through calculated demands that exploited cultural identity and community pride. By threatening violence against those who failed to participate in jazz performance, the killer forced an entire city to engage in collective behavior that blurred the lines between celebration and submission. The case established a template for how criminals could use cultural symbols and community traditions as weapons of psychological control that extended far beyond their actual capacity for physical violence. But not all mysteries from the past involved human predators exploiting fear and cultural symbols. Sometimes the most unsettling discoveries came from artifacts that challenged our fundamental understanding of what previous civilizations could achieve, revealing that our ancestors possessed knowledge and capabilities that seemed impossible for their time. The book that defies all translation. The Voynich manuscript sits in Yale University's Voynich library, its 240 pages filled with flowing script that resembles no known writing system from medieval Europe or anywhere else in the world. For over 5 centuries, this mysterious book has obsessed some researchers and consumed entire careers. It's approximately 35,000 words written in an elegant script that appears consistent and purposeful, yet follows patterns that linguists find impossible to categorize. Some characters appear frequently, while others are rare, creating statistical distributions that resemble natural languages, but the underlying structure remains completely impenetrable to analysis. The letters suggest a real language rather than random scribbles, yet no scholar, cryptographer, or computer program has ever successfully decoded a single sentence. What makes the manuscript particularly disturbing are the illustrations that accompany the mysterious text. The pages contain detailed drawings of plants that don't match any known botanical species. These aren't crude medieval sketches, but carefully rendered illustrations showing roots, stems, leaves, and flowers in precise detail. Botanists have spent decades trying to identify these plants, comparing them to species from around the world, but none match the drawings exactly. Some illustrations show characteristics from multiple plant families combined in ways that suggest either unknown species or deliberate fictional creations. The astronomical sections contain circular diagrams filled with text and symbols that appear to track celestial movements, but the calculations don't match any known medieval astronomical system. These diagrams show star charts, zodiacal symbols, and what appear to be calendar systems, but their organization follows principles that astronomers cannot decode. Some pages contain fold-out diagrams that extend beyond the normal page size, revealing complex circular charts filled with text and symbols arranged in concentric rings. Perhaps the most bizarre illustrations appear in the biological sections, which show naked women bathing in elaborate systems of interconnected pools and tubes. These drawings suggest knowledge of human anatomy and hydraulic engineering, but their purpose remains completely mysterious. The women are drawn in various poses, some standing in green liquid, others connected to complex plumbing systems that appear to circulate fluids through multiple chambers. These images have generated countless theories about their meaning, from medical treatments to alchemical processes, but no interpretation has gained scholarly acceptance. Carbon dating analysis confirmed that the manuscript was created sometime between 1404 and 1438, placing it squarely in the late medieval period. However, this dating creates additional mysteries rather than solving them. No known writing system from this period resembles the Voynich script, and the manuscript's sophisticated illustrations suggest knowledge that supposedly wasn't available to medieval scholars. The quality of the vellum and inks confirms the manuscript's authenticity as a medieval document, but its contents seem to come from an entirely different intellectual tradition. During World War II, American cryptographers who had successfully broken Japanese and German military codes turned their attention to the Voynich manuscript. William Friedman, one of America's greatest cryptographers, spent decades studying the manuscript without achieving any breakthrough. His team applied every known code-breaking technique, from frequency analysis to pattern recognition, but the text resisted all attempts at decryption. These experts, who had decoded some of the most sophisticated encryption systems ever created, found themselves completely baffled by the medieval text. Modern computer analysis has brought unprecedented computational power to bear on the manuscript's mysteries, but digital technology has proven no more successful than human intuition. Researchers have used artificial intelligence programs designed to recognize linguistic patterns, statistical analysis software that can process millions of character combinations, and machine learning algorithms trained on dozens of ancient languages. These programs can identify subtle patterns in the text that human researchers might miss, but they consistently fail to find coherent meaning in the manuscript's contents. Some scholars argue that the manuscript represents an elaborate hoax created by a medieval charlatan seeking to impress wealthy patrons with mysterious knowledge. This theory suggests that the consistent script and systematic illustrations were designed to create the appearance of genuine scholarship while containing no actual information. However, statistical analysis of the text reveals patterns that are difficult to fake, including consistent character frequencies and grammatical structures that suggest a real underlying language system. Other researchers remain convinced that the manuscript contains genuine lost knowledge from an unknown intellectual tradition. They point to the consistency of the script across all 240 pages, the sophisticated botanical and astronomical illustrations, and the complex organizational structure of the text as evidence that it represents real scholarship from a culture whose knowledge systems have been completely forgotten. This interpretation suggests that entire branches of medieval learning may have disappeared so thoroughly that we can no longer access their fundamental assumptions. The manuscript seems to encourage obsession by offering tantalizing hints of meaning that ultimately lead nowhere, creating a psychological trap for researchers who become convinced that the solution lies just beyond their current understanding. Some scholars have spent decades developing elaborate theories about the text's meaning, only to see their interpretations collapse under scrutiny. The Voynich manuscript is not just a puzzle, it's an example of knowledge deliberately or accidentally cut off from history. But sometimes the most disturbing mysteries didn't involve ancient texts or lost civilizations. Sometimes they involved modern people making decisions so inexplicable that investigators could only conclude something unknown and compelling had occurred. The mountain pass where 9 hikers died. In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers ventured into the Ural Mountains for what should have been a routine winter expedition. Igor Dyatlov led this group of university students and recent graduates through the remote wilderness of the Soviet Union. These weren't novice campers but skilled outdoors people who understood mountain survival and had planned their route carefully. Within hours of making camp on February 1st, something would drive them from their tent into the deadly Siberian cold, where temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. None of them would survive the night. The search team that discovered their abandoned campsite 3 weeks later found a scene that defied explanation. The tent had been cut open from the inside, with slashes that allowed the occupants to escape quickly without unfastening the entrance. Their boots, warm clothing, and survival equipment remained inside the tent, indicating that whatever drove them out had been sudden and urgent enough to override basic survival instincts. Imagine the terror that would cause experienced winter campers to abandon their only protection against deadly cold while wearing minimal clothing. The footprints leading away from the tent showed that all 9 hikers had left together, walking in single file through the snow toward a forest about a mile from the campsite. The trail disappeared after a few hundred yards where wind and snow had covered the tracks. The bodies were discovered scattered across the mountainside over the following weeks, each death presenting mysteries that investigators couldn't explain through conventional analysis. 2 hikers were found near the remains of a small fire they had built using branches broken from nearby trees. They had died from hypothermia, but their hands showed evidence of climbing trees to break off firewood, suggesting they had maintained enough coordination to attempt survival activities before succumbing to the cold. The fact that they could build a fire indicated they had some time after leaving the tent, yet they never returned to retrieve their warm clothing and equipment. 3 more bodies were found between the forest and the abandoned tent, apparently having died while attempting to return to their campsite. These hikers had made it partway back up the slope before collapsing from hypothermia and exhaustion. The positioning of their bodies suggested they had been trying to crawl through the snow when death overtook them. The final 4 bodies weren't discovered until 2 months later, buried under several feet of snow in a ravine near the forest. These hikers had survived longer than their companions, but their deaths raised disturbing questions that forensic experts couldn't answer satisfactorily. 3 of them showed signs of massive internal trauma that would typically result from high-impact collisions or crushing forces. One hiker had major chest fractures, another suffered a fractured skull, and a third had severe chest injuries. The nature of these injuries baffled medical examiners who conducted the autopsies. The internal damage was consistent with extreme blunt force trauma, yet their bodies showed no external wounds or signs of impact that would typically accompany such severe internal injuries. The force required to cause these fractures would have been tremendous, yet the skin remained intact and showed no evidence of the violence that had destroyed internal organs and bones. Some investigators later reported traces of radiation on clothing items recovered from the scene, a contested claim that Soviet authorities never adequately explained. Local residents reported sightings of unexplained lights in the sky around the time of the incident, describing glowing phenomena that moved in unusual patterns. These witness accounts weren't collected until months after the event, and their reliability remains questionable due to the time gap between observation and reporting. Soviet authorities concluded their investigation by stating that the deaths resulted from an unknown compelling force, a phrase that revealed more about official confusion than actual findings. This vague determination satisfied no one and only intensified speculation about what could have driven 9 experienced hikers to make fatal decisions that violated every principle of wilderness survival. The case files were classified and remained sealed for decades, preventing independent researchers from examining the evidence or developing alternative theories. The Dyatlov Pass incident demonstrates how quickly rational people can abandon logic when confronted with something that triggers primal survival responses. These hikers understood that leaving their tent meant certain death, yet something compelled them to make that choice anyway. Some events produce behavior we can barely explain, people making choices that contradict survival instincts, and these remain the most unsettling mysteries of all. The case serves as a disturbing reminder that human behavior under extreme stress can become completely unpredictable, and that some events may be too strange for official investigations to explain adequately through conventional analysis. What makes cases like Dyatlov Pass particularly haunting isn't just their mystery, but what they reveal about the limits of human understanding when confronted with the inexplicable. Conclusion: Jack the Ripper achieved immortality through anonymity. Entire colonies disappeared without explanation. Ancient devices challenge everything we thought we knew about human capability. These cases reveal how spectacle and power shape death itself, turning victims into legends while killers vanish into history. Perhaps most disturbing is that knowledge and answers can vanish as relentlessly as people do. Civilizations lose technologies that took generations to develop. The real terror lies in accepting that some doors in history remain forever locked, like those floorboards creaking beneath your feet while you stand unknowingly on human remains. If these stories unsettled you, like and subscribe for more investigations into history's darker corners. Tell us in the comments which unresolved case haunts you most.